Okay, you should be able to hear me now. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If you can just indicate that you can hear me now. Yes, okay, great. Okay, so before we start, I'm just going to let you know about one of our upcoming webinar series or course. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. Na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. We seek refuge in Allah from the accursed shaitan. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. We begin in the name of Allah, most merciful, especially merciful. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana. Glory be to you, O Allah. There is no knowledge for us except that which you teach us. Allahumma 'allimna ma yanfa'una. O Allah, teach us that which will be beneficial for us. Fazidna ilma, and increase us in knowledge. Warzuqna fahma, and grant us understanding. Ya muqallib al-qulub, O change of hearts. Thabbit qulubana ala dinik. Keep our hearts firm on your deen. Allahumma ja'al a'malana khalisatan liwajhik. O Allah, grant our actions to be done sincerely for your sake. وَلَا تَجْعَلْ فِيهَا حَظًّا لِغَيْرِكَ, and let there not be in them a portion for other than you. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, can you hear me now? Someone saying that they're still not hearing, and asking if I can speak louder. Can you indicate in the chat box that I'm clear? Yes, no, anyone? Yes, okay, great. Okay, so before we begin, I'm just going to let you know about one of our upcoming webinars, and that is on ADHD in adults, what you need to know. So this is for people with ADHD, family members of people with ADHD, and anyone who just wants to know more about it. And also will also include advices for Muslims specifically that are living with ADHD. So this will be on Mondays for 4 weeks from 8 o'clock till 9 o'clock in the evenings, starting on the 3rd of October. So if you are in our WhatsApp groups, you will get the info about that, the registration link. We'll put it in the chat box over here as well. So please do register for that. And also please let your family and friends, anyone who may be interested, know about it so that they can also register for that. So today, our webinar is on understanding the basics of infant mental health. And this will be facilitated by Moezna Patience, who is a registered dietitian with a master's degree in infant mental health from Stellenbosch University. She currently works for an NGO and practices privately in a part-time capacity. So I'm now going to hand over to our presenter, Moezna Jacobs, who will be speaking about infant mental health.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and shukran so much for the opportunity. I'm just going to quickly open up my presentation. Okay, I'm just going to hide my camera while I'm talking so that you can actually focus on the screen. Shukran again so much for the opportunity to talk about this topic. I think what's really nice about infant mental health is that it isn't actually just for mental health practitioners. It isn't actually just for health practitioners. It really is a topic that everybody should know. And I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity to talk about it because it's something that we actually do see on a daily basis, but we don't actually realize that we're looking at infant mental health. So I'm just going to give a basic explanation of what it is and what we do as infant mental health practitioners and how it fits into our daily lives as people, not only as health professionals, but generally just for everybody to know. And obviously, the first thing that people normally ask about is what is infant mental health? So infant mental health is really focused on the social and emotional development of an infant, and that is related to their capacity to express emotions, to regulate the emotions, to form relationships, to explore the environments that they live in. And when we're looking at how an infant's mental health is growing or developing, we're looking at these specific things, and I will go back to this throughout the whole presentation. The importance of infant mental health is that in early life, a lot of the experiences that infants go through forms the foundation for what they do in life, how they deal with things, how they learn, how they develop. And sometimes we don't realize how important infant mental health is because we often just look at the physical development of an infant. But infant mental health is just as important as physical health. So we want to look at the social and emotional development of an infant as well as the physical development, because this positive social and emotional development actually has a big impact on the brain development of a child. And we'll see during the presentation how that actually works out. We also need to realize that any contextual factors like poor social circumstances or social inequalities, any environmental factors or environmental behaviors that are negative might impact the child in a negative way. And one of the other very important things that we need to look at is the mental health of the caregiver. So the social and emotional development of an infant is directly related to the mental health of the caregiver that the infant is exposed to in their very early life. And the examples that I'm going to use throughout the presentation are what an ideal situation should look like for good infant mental health. So the job of an infant really is to learn, to sleep, to eat, to grow, and to develop. But what they need to learn in this very, very early stages is how to know that they are experiencing some kind of emotion. They need to know how to deal with what's happening to them. And they are completely reliant on their caregiver to do this. So when they are learning in this very early life, the caregiver is the one that is teaching the infant how to navigate through the world that they are now in, coming from, being in utero. So the first 1,000 days of a child's life refers to the time from conception up until just after 2 years, around 3 years old. And this first 1,000 days of an infant's life is the most important time of anybody's life, actually. A lot of things that we experience in our infancy actually impacts our life for a very long time. And because it's such an important time, it does give an infant the building blocks for life. So what we want to do in this first 1,000 days, or even the first 1,000 days and beyond, is optimize the benefits for the infant and reduce any possible harms. And of course, with any kind of stress, it basically creates the risk factors for the infant, and these risk factors does make the infant more vulnerable for something that might not go right. So any negative risk factors will basically create an opportunity for underdevelopment. We want to just know that the risk factors here I'm referring to, again, like I said in the first slide, is anything that could cause stress in the household or in the environment for the infant. If there's any poor social circumstances, anything like that, or even with the caregiver mental health, if anything like that is present in the infant's life in this first 1,000 days, it does put the infant at risk for underdevelopment. So early experiences in the infant's life is where we want to teach the infant basically about the world that they live in. We want to teach them about their social and emotional development, and we want to teach them about relationships. So whatever the infant is being exposed to in the early life, or that early experiences within that first 1,000 days, it's going to impact their social and emotional development. It's also going to impact the relationships that they have in the early life, as well as the relationships that they create later on in life. And it's completely dependent on the primary caregiver. So a primary caregiver is the person that the infant attaches to in that early life. And it does not necessarily have to be the mother, because we do have many cases where there's adoption, where there's foster care, where the mother is deceased and there's another parent or another caregiver looking after the child. But the primary caregiver is the one that the infant is going to attach to in that early life. And they are the ones that is going to teach the child about their social and emotional development. They're going to teach the child about their relationships. They're going to teach the child about what the world is like. So if we have a primary caregiver that is seeing the world through anxious eyes, for example, we're going to have a baby that is going to experience the world through that anxiety that the caregiver is experiencing. So the primary caregiver is very, very important in the infant's life. And we want to make sure that the primary caregiver is also being taken care of, so that that primary caregiver can take care of the infant and develop that social and emotional skills, develop the relationships, And so that the developmental cycle, the whole developmental cycle with social and emotional development as well as physical development, actually the child can reach their full potential as opposed to just surviving in the world that they are in. We need to understand that infants, any early experiences in an infant's life is going to impact their developmental cycle. And the developmental cycle is going to impact their social and emotional regulation, as well as the relationships that they have, not only in their early life, but as they go through life in their toddlerhood, in their young child life, in their adolescence, into their adulthood. So we can think about experiences that we've had in our early life and how that might have impacted us as adults, because sometimes we do things a certain way, we respond or react to things in a certain way. And that is actually something that we were taught in our very, very early life. So, sorry. When we're looking at the what do we need to look at in terms of stress for an infant? So I did say that sometimes things happen in the household, sometimes things happen in the environment, and there are certain good stresses that infants need to experience within their early life, because we need to teach infants how to navigate through the stress. So one of the things that I'm going to use an example throughout the presentation. So I'm going to use an example of an infant being bathed. That is quite a stressful event for a child. So the stress of the baby being undressed and the baby being put into the water and all these strange things happening is a good stress for the infant, because these are things that need to happen. They're not stresses that, are causing harm to the infant. They're not stresses that could cause problems in like a developmental delay or things like that. These are things that needs to be done in order for the infant to be well. But it also requires the caregiver to allow the stress to happen, but to be there so that the infant knows that this is an okay stress. Okay, so in infant mental health, we talk about regulation of emotions, repairing anything that could go wrong, or the caregiver can buffer things depending on what the stress is. So if we use the example of an infant being bathed, in an ideal situation, the mother or the caregiver is going to tell the infant, number one, the caregiver is going to recognize that the infant is experiencing the stress. So we need to recognize that this is a person, and that this person, no matter how small the person is experiencing some kind of stress. So we're going to recognize that the infant is experiencing a stress. The next thing that the caregiver needs to do is to tell the infant that she's recognizing something is going on. So the caregiver should respond by saying, I know you're upset that I'm taking the clothing off, but I need to put you in the water to clean you off. And then I'm going to put you back onto the towel to dry you off and dress you again. Okay, what the caregiver is doing in that situation is regulating the emotion. The caregiver is recognizing that the infant is experiencing some sort of stress. And then the caregiver is regulating the emotion to say, I know that you're upset, but I'm just going to quickly take the clothing off so that I can bath you. And then putting the clothing back on is repairing what just happened right now. That interaction with the caregiver is allowing the infant to know that this is a stress that I might experience again because my mother or my caregiver is going to bath me again. But my caregiver is there to help me to navigate through the emotion and then repairing what's going on by closing me up when I get out of the bath and dressing me again. So these are things that need to happen with every kind of situation when it comes to infant social and emotional development. The other reason why we need stress, well, we all as adults deal with different kinds of stress in our life. And if you are able to navigate through your stresses in your life as an adult, it means that somebody taught you how to navigate through your stresses as an infant, because we don't magically know how to do these things. Somebody has to teach you. Now, for an infant, the caregiver is the person that is basically telling the infant, it's not the end of the world that I'm taking the clothing off. It's not the end of the world that I need to put you in the bath. So the infant recognizes that every time that there might be a stressor, there is another person, the caregiver, who will help me navigate through all these things that's happening in my life. And that is the start of infant mental health. That being exposed to the stress is important for the infant, but the caregiver is going to regulate, the caregiver is going to repair, or the caregiver is going to buffer. It's also why we shouldn't lie to infants, because infants need to see the reality of the world. We can't teach them to navigate through a world that doesn't exist. We actually need to teach them how to navigate through the world regardless of the stresses, because sometimes things happen and we need to be able to know how to deal with that. Now, a caregiver who has good mental health will be able to do this without much effort. So when we see patients, or when I see infants or I see patients, and I usually ask the caregiver, about themselves, we find that a lot of mothers or caregivers who struggle to recognize that there is something going on with the infant's emotions are often struggling to recognize that something's going on with their own emotions. And this regulation repair situation needs to happen regularly, so that the infant is going to always be aware that there's another person in this world that's going to take care of me, whether it be a physical need or a social or emotional need. So when we look at also different types of stresses that the infant might experience, if we are looking at the other side of the coin where there's prolonged stress. So the picture on the screen shows, on the left side, it shows the brain development of a healthy child. And on the right picture, it shows brain development of an infant affected by environmental stress. So this kind of stress is what we call prolonged or toxic stress. And basically it's where the infant is experiencing some sort of stressor. Could be, the infant's being bathed, or the infant's being moved, or something is going on in the infant's life. But there isn't another caregiver or another adult that is telling this infant that it's going to be okay. Or there isn't a caregiver telling the infant or teaching the infant how to navigate through the emotion and how to navigate through the thing that's causing the stress. So toxic stress is usually where it's prolonged stress and there's no repair, there's no regulation, there's no caregiver coming to save the infant from whatever stress they're going through. Now, something that I found very interesting in my studies, when I was doing a lot of my reading up on infant mental health and maternal mental health, is that sometimes we don't, or we find ourselves in situations, me especially as a health professional, I find myself in a lot of situations where mothers are sitting with the infants and the infant is expressing a need. So how infants usually express their need is they either cry or they have a change in behavior. And crying is a very, very important tool for communication for the infant, because it is an indication that something is going on. And this is the reason why we don't like quiet children. We don't like it when mothers come to us and say, the baby doesn't make any sounds. That's not a good thing. We need the infant to express their needs, and we need them to show, if it's not in the form of crying, we need them to do something to indicate to the caregiver that something is not right. Now we have this situations where there's this prolonged kind of stress, toxic stress, but even just not responding to the need when the infant is expressing the need, that is also a form of prolonged or toxic stress. What's happening is that the infant is either crying, they're throwing tantrums. Those are all indications that something is going on inside their emotions and they don't know how to deal with it. The caregiver needs to respond to that crying or needs to respond to the change in behavior. And sometimes the caregiver ignores the infant. Sometimes they, also feel a heightened emotion. So they also respond in the same way that the infant is trying to reach out to them. So the infant's crying and the caregiver will shout back. And there are times when the caregiver does not even hear the crying of the infant, and the caregiver does not even respond because they are unable to really recognize that the infant is trying to show them that they need something. Now, I was saying that something that I read that was very, very interesting to me was that caregivers or mothers who were not heard as infants are sometimes unable to hear the needs of the child. And it's such a deep concept to understand, because it's quite alarming to think how many people actually that we come across sometimes don't hear the needs of the infant because they were not heard as infants. And that's why I said in the beginning that there's a lot of things that happens in our infancy that impacts us into adulthood, and we don't realize how much of an impact this early infant mental health has on our life. So when we are dealing with mothers who are not hearing the needs of the infant, or they don't know how to respond, or the infants are just, they don't know how else to get the attention of the infant, we have this toxic stress. And the picture on the right is you can see the little gaps in the brain development. And this is the frontal lobe. So you can see that there are quite a lot of gaps in this brain. So this infant is going to have poor physical development as well as poor social and emotional development. And this is going to impact their learning when they go to school. And we often only pick up these things when they are at school going age, which is a little bit too late. Not impossible to make changes, but it is quite late for us to pick it up. Another thing that infants actually might experience is despair. There was a study done in a Romanian orphanage where the infants were obviously moved to the orphanage because both their parents passed on. And the infants in this orphanage, they were obviously looking for the caregivers, they were crying out for the caregivers, they were needing something. But in an orphanage, there's limited staff, not everybody can be attended to. And what happened is that the infants actually stopped crying. And initially the staff thought that the infants were just okay. But what they did is they actually went into despair, because to them, it meant that, to the infant, it meant that nobody was coming to save me. Nobody was coming to tell me that things are going to be okay. So now they just stopped looking. They stopped looking for attention. They stopped crying. They stopped trying to get someone to respond to their needs. Again, we don't want infants to go into that situation, because they end up being adults who don't know how to express their needs when they need to. And we want to know that an infant can express whatever they need to express in whichever way they need to express it, but the caregiver needs to respond to that need. And when there's poor maternal mental health, the caregiver or the mother might not be able to respond appropriately to the infant. So we have this thing called social emotional reciprocity, where there has to be a response to the infant, and basically what they call it servant return. So the infant is going to say something to the mother or the caregiver, and the caregiver is going to respond, and that reciprocity is going to develop the social and emotional skills of the infant. So how this happens is the caregiver is responding appropriately to the infant, because the infant requires the response. They need to know that the caregiver is going to respond to them. And an example I can use here is, I'm sure there are a lot of mothers that are listening. And whenever you leave your child somewhere, the person will say, oh, the baby was so good, they didn't give up any hassle. As soon as the caregiver comes in, they almost like go a little bit crazy. That is because infants only basically let go around the caregiver that is responsive to them. Because the primary caregiver or the mother is the safety net for the infant. So they know that whatever they're going to go through, this caregiver is going to respond appropriately. So they might have been keeping all the emotions in until their caregiver is there. They also know that if they fall apart, their caregiver is going to put them back together. That's why children are more emotionally crazy when their mothers or their caregivers or primary caregivers are around, because they know that that caregiver is going to respond to them. And all of those responses cause huge neurological connections in the brain. that first picture that I showed where the brain was lit up is what the social and emotional reciprocity does. It creates these little connections in the brain, and the more times the caregiver and the infant have a conversation or any kind of response type of thing going on, the more neurological connections basically are created. And the more neurological connections are created in the brain, the better their social and emotional development, the better their physical development and their growth. So we need a lot of this neurological connections to happen in that first 1,000 days, so that when they start schooling, they are, ready to take on the world because their caregiver has prepared them, as best as the caregiver could for the time that the caregiver was the only one really having any role to play in the infant's development. And the neurological connections are important in this early life, because if there is if the caregiver is not responding, or there's very little response, or there's very little social and emotional reciprocity, and there's no real interactions with an infant, whether it's with the caregiver or not, any parts of the brain that is not being used in that early life, it dies out. And there's only one other time in a person's life that you can reconnect those connections, and that is when they are in their adolescent period. But we don't know when specifically. So we want to try and get as many of those neurological connections up and running in the first 1,000 days. When we're looking at adverse experiences that an infant might experience in their first 1,000 days, in their early life, like I said, if there's poor maternal mental health, if the caregivers are not responding to the needs, and the infant is trying to express a need, and there is no response from the caregiver, it obviously increases their risk of poor mental health, poor infant mental health. And mental health sometimes displays or presents itself as a physical ailment or physical disease. So sometimes we do get patients that are experiencing, problems with their development, problems with their growth. And when we look at the mental health screening, we do mental health screening with the mother, and we ask questions about how responsive is the caregiver. We find that sometimes there's an issue there. And so it presents itself as a physical disease, but the issue is actually with the mental health of both the caregiver and the infant. And babies actually become how they are by mimicking a lot of the things that they see. So there's the still face experiment that was done by a doctor in the USA, a psychologist in the USA. And you can actually go YouTube still face experiment, you'll see the video, but I just put the picture up here to show you. The purpose of the experiment was to show when there is responsive caregiving and when the responsive caregiving stops. So babies often mirror or mimic what they're seeing, and the caregiver often does the same thing. So that social and emotional reciprocity happens a lot in a healthy mother and infant relationship. So you can see in the first two pictures on top, the mother is basically laughing with the infant. She's tickling the baby. She's doing all sorts of things with the infant. And you can see that the infant's face is similar to what the mother's face looks like. Then in the second two pictures, the mother starts to straighten up her face. So she's completely removing any emotion from her face, and she's basically making it completely still. And you can see that the baby's reaction immediately changes because she knows that the mother is not doing anything. Now, what the babies often do here is when the caregiver is not responding, is they start to do as much movements as they can or make as much sounds as they can to get a response out of the infant, out of the mother or out of the caregiver. So in the video, this mother is doing the still face for a few seconds, but the baby almost looks like she's losing her mind because the caregiver is not responding to her. And it's quite alarming to see how quickly the infant recognizes that the mother is not responding. And immediately the infant starts to cry, and she starts to, her limbs are going everywhere, arms are going up, she's kicking her feet. She's doing everything that she can to get the mother to respond to her. So infants also know when the caregiver is not responding, and they often do this. They cry or they throw tantrums. It is really a need that they are trying to express, to say something is going on and I need my caregiver to respond to me because I don't know what to do with this emotion. And again, the responsive caregiving allows the mother to regulate and to name the emotion and say, I know you're feeling sad. I know you're feeling frustrated. So at the end of this video, the mother actually stops the still face and then she picks the baby up out of the chair and she cuddles her and says, she apologizes for what she did. So babies know when something is not right. And when they have a change in behavior, often it's change in behavior, crying. Sometimes when they refuse food, that's also, a red flag for us to check what's going on in the relationship between the caregiver and the infant. And at 18 months already, they know that A causes B. So if they're going to do something, the caregiver is going to respond in a certain way. And most of the time, it's this responsive caregiving is important in that aspect because they're going to know how the caregiver is going to respond to them. Another part that we need to talk about is the words that we use with infants. And when the infant comes into the world and they have a caregiver that they attach to, they perceive the world or believe how the world is through the caregiver. So the caregiver's job is really to just make sure that the world is safe. And yes, there are lots of parenting skills and things that we can learn as we go along through the journey of parenting. But the most important thing that the infant needs to know is that the caregiver is going to make sure that the world is safe for them. Now, sometimes we don't only do things that is not, of benefit to the infant in terms of their mental health, but we also say things that might not be of benefit to the infant and their mental health and their social and emotional development. And we also need to think about what happens when there's no safety for this infant. What happens when the infant is in an environment where they don't know whether the world that they're in is safe or not. Because the infant needs to grow up knowing that the caregiver is going to be there to assist them through whatever they need to navigate in that early life, in that early experiences. But we need to think about what happens when there is no safety. And this doesn't only happen by action. Sometimes it happens by the use of negative words. And one of the most common cultural habitual words that we use is the word naughty. It actually has such a negative connotation that I think that a lot of children grow up thinking that that's what they are, that word describes them. Because often an instant response to when an infant does something or throws a tantrum is, you're naughty. And it's not an appropriate word to use for an infant that is learning how to navigate through this world that they've just come into. It's not an appropriate concept to even think in that way, that how can an infant be naughty? They don't know how to do many things. They don't understand many things. Their sense of self only comes, after 18 months. A lot of their emotional development, their deeper emotional development only happens after 2 years. So the use of negative words also has an impact on the infant's mental health, because culturally it's a lot about the child is naughty, the child is rude, the child is doing this. But as caregivers, we actually need to take a step back and wonder or just think about, what are we saying to an infant? If you're telling somebody their whole life that they're naughty, it's almost, guaranteed that this person will think that that's what defines them. And sometimes those words and not having a safety net to fall back into when they are experiencing some kind of crazy emotion sends them into a direction where they make poor choices because of this. And they end up being, children that they do whatever because there's no adult telling them any differently. There's also no adult providing a safety net for them. So they become, whatever you're saying to them, that's what they become. And we really need to think about the words that we use and how we use it and the context that we use it. And like I'm saying, I know tantrums is really difficult to deal with. It's something that puts you as a primary caregiver also in a heightened emotional state, because you don't know what to do. The infant is just like in the middle of a mall, child is just throwing themselves on the floor and screaming, and you're standing there like, what in the world am I supposed to do right now? That is the infant telling you that they need something from you. And if you are struggling to control your own emotions, that is something that you also need to deal with, to realize that as a caregiver, you also have emotions. And as a caregiver, you were also an infant. So you need to think about how your infant mental health developed in life to make you the adult that you are, and how are you responding to your child, because they need to know that you are not going to leave them, that you're going to provide that safety no matter what. And that brings me to my next slide, because in society we have this very weird pressure that I don't know where it comes from. It's just there that you need to be a good mother. And in infant mental health, we talk about good enough. You are a good enough mother. You are a good enough parent. You are a good enough caregiver. You have to believe that you are good enough for your infant, because that is how it is. That is the nature of having a child, that you are good enough for your infant. And when it comes to mothering or parenting, like I said, there are lots of skills that you can learn, but you always, first thing you need to tell yourself is that you're good enough, that no matter what society says, you are good enough to do whatever you need to do. And the decisions that you're going to make for your infant is going to be good enough. And part of being a good enough mother, or part of being a good enough parent, is to realize that you have a spectrum of emotions. As a parent and as a caregiver, you have a lot of emotions that you are experiencing, and so does your infant. So you also need to allow the infant to see that spectrum of emotions, because we don't live in a world where everyone is happy all the time. We experience many different emotions on a daily basis, and sometimes you might need to take a step back and deal with your own emotions before you can deal with the infant's emotion. So babies and infants need a mindful parent. They need to know that their parent is thinking of them. You need to be able to keep your infant in mind, and that is what most parents do. If you ask anybody, if you ask a mother or a parent about themselves, they often first talk about their children. They often first talk about, the people that they take care of before they actually start talking about themselves. That means that they are keeping the people that they care for in their mind. That's what a mindful parent is. The infant also needs the connection and the attachment between the caregiver and themselves. All they need to know is that you're there, that you will navigate through the world, you will help them deal with whatever they need to deal with, and that you will be there if they're falling apart, because that's normally what they do. And then again, they need a caregiver that just responds to them. If they are expressing a need, they need to know that the caregiver is going to say, I'm here, I know what's happening. And again, we need to think about the mother who wasn't heard as an infant. And we need to help those mothers, help those parents deal with, what are they not hearing? What about the infant are they not seeing? Or what about the infant are they not responding to? And it was always a strange thing for me when I was working in public service. I would sit in the health facility and hear these babies cry and think, I'm 100% sure that these babies are with their mothers. So I would go out and ask, whose baby is crying? And the mother would say to me, oh, it's my baby, they're naughty. The child is just naughty. But it really is that responsiveness that they might have not received in their infancy as a mother that is not allowing them to respond appropriately to their infants. And if you do hear your child, if you do hear your infant, you don't realize how lucky you are to have been heard as an infant, to know that you can hear your own child's needs, because there are lots of people that don't have that. Now we go to the flip side, where we have too good mothering. This is where, I don't know how else to explain, but basically when we have helicopter parenting, where the parent hovers so much over the infant that they don't allow the infant to experience any kind of stress. And like I said, having an infant be exposed to certain stresses in life allows them to learn how to name the emotion, how to regulate the emotion, and how to navigate through whatever is causing the stress. And it's a skill that will take you far in life. Many people don't know how to deal with stress. Many adults don't know how to deal with stress. So it's something that you have to teach the infant, that it's going to be okay. This is how you're going to work through it. This is what we're going to do. We're going to work on a plan, and this is how we're going to navigate through it. Now, if we have this too good mothering situation, we have a parent who might be buffering the stress before it happens, or completely removing any kind of stress from the infant's life. Now, the stresses, when infants are being regulated in that manner, they are being basically giving them the ability to learn to think. They can think because their minds are developing from a very early age. And that is why we need to speak to infants like they are people. We need to use actual words, actual sentences, so that we can develop the mind more and more and more as they are going through their first 1,000 days. When they don't learn to think in infancy, it means that the caregiver is going to think for the infant, and the caregiver is going to buffer the stress. The caregiver is going to basically create this little bubble for them that they don't need to go out of. But in reality, we all step out of that bubble that our caregivers provide for us. And when we enter the real world, we see this. I'm sure many of us see adults, we work with adults, we interact with adults who don't know how to think. They don't think about consequences. They don't think about other people. They don't know how to navigate their own stresses. They often blame other people for situations that they find themselves in, or they feel like, the world owes them the comfort. And this is what happens when there's too good mothering. We need to look at all the aspects of parenting and think about what are we doing and are we doing what the infant needs as opposed to what the caregiver wants. Because at the end of the day, you are preparing your infant to survive the world that they are in. And like I said earlier, there are a spectrum of emotions that we experience. There are a spectrum of emotions that the infant will learn and will have to navigate through. And in this very early life, in this first 1,000 days and beyond, is the time where we really need to teach them that. So I think this is my last slide. The key message that I really want to bring across is that infants learn from a very, very young age, and they are completely reliant on the caregiver to teach them. They need to know that the caregiver is going to be there to help them regulate their emotions, name their emotions. They need to know that the caregiver will help them should anything go wrong, or at least teach them how to handle anything that could possibly go wrong. And they need to know that the caregiver is also well enough to hear them when they need the caregiver or when they are trying to express a need.
Shukran so much for that. We do have some questions, and just to everyone, please, you can still ask your questions. You can put them in the Q&A box. Would you like me to ask you the questions, or do you want to have a look at them yourself?
You can ask them.
Okay, sure. So someone asks, is sleep training considered toxic stress?
It is in a way, because the infant needs to know that the caregiver is going to be there. And usually with sleep training, you actually have to ignore the infant and just let them cry it out. There are other ways of doing sleep training that doesn't involve putting the infant in a different room or basically just leaving them to cry it out. There are other ways of doing it, but definitely that intense sleep training where the caregiver completely ignores the crying of the infant is not advised for good infant mental health.
Okay, shukran for that. Somebody asks, in terms of the approach where parents let their child cry until they sleep, would that also put the child into despair rather than train them?
Yes, that is exactly what the sleep training would do, because the infant would eventually stop crying, not because they're okay, but because nobody is coming back to them to say, it's okay, I know you're upset right now, I know that you want me, but I need you to sleep because sleep is good for you, you're going to feel better in the morning. These are the kinds of positive reinforcements that the parent need to use, as opposed to just let them cry it out, because they need to know that the caregiver is going to come back for them. When they go into despair, it's that they've put themselves in a situation and told themselves that nobody's coming for me. And that's what we want to avoid.
Sure. Somebody asks, what traits within ourselves and our actions should send us alarm bells that we are becoming toxic?
I think as parents, it's the first thing is how you respond to your infant or how you respond to your child. So it's the type of response that might alarm you. If you're watching from the outside, if you feel like that response wasn't appropriate to your child, that's something that you can think about. And again, it's the non-responsive parent, basically. So if your infant is doing something or that your child is doing something and you're just not responding, that also means that you either have something that you're not dealing with that doesn't allow you to hear the need of the infant or the child, or you are in a space where your mental health is just, you don't have the capacity to deal with whatever the infant or the child needs. So those are things that you want to look out for.
Okay. Somebody says the weaning process is also quite stressful for both the child and mom. How damaging is this emotionally to the baby?
I'm assuming this is weaning for feeding.
From breastfeeding.
Breastfeeding. So again, it's the words that you're going to use to say, I know that you're upset, that I need to take you off the breastfeeding, or I know I need to stop the breastfeeding, but give the explanation to the infant. They do understand that you are building their capacity to think and to learn. So you can explain the whole process and say, you know what, this is what I'm going to do. You actually need to prepare the infant to say, on Monday, I'm going to stop the night feeds. I know you're going to be upset. I know this is how you're feeling. Help them to recognize the emotion that they're feeling, number one. Tell them that you're still there. You'll provide a different type of comfort, and then find a replacement for the feed, for whatever you're taking away. There has to be a replacement for it. But use the words, use positive reinforcements, remind them that you're still there as the caregiver. You're not leaving, you're just taking something away, because give them the reason, give them the explanation. They do, it does take time. Weaning takes a lot of time. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks realistically. So prepare them before the weaning starts, and during the process, just continue that positive reinforcement with them.
Yes. Somebody says, is it spoiling your child by keeping them a lot? I hear it a lot from people. I'm not sure what she means, but I think she means like holding the child a lot.
No, I don't think, like the spoiling, I don't know, that's like a really judgmental word to use, but the spoiling is not really a thing when you're holding your infant or you're holding your child. It's more about what I was talking about, the too good mothering, where there's like just you holding the child in a little bubble and not letting them experience life, but holding your infant, holding them close to you, letting them have you as a source of comfort is definitely not spoiling them. In fact, it's better for their development. It's better for their infant's mental health and for their social and emotional development, because they know that their caregiver is there. And if that is a source of comfort for them, then you continue that, because you're not doing any harm to the infant. It's only when you are holding them in a space that doesn't allow them to experience anything else in life, that could be damaging to their development.
Okay, great. Somebody says, I would like to know from what age we have sustained shared thinking with children.
Sustained?
Shared thinking. Yeah, I'm honestly not sure what the person means.
I don't know, can the person just elaborate a bit on the question?
Okay, the person who asked that, can you please rephrase your question? You raised your hand. I'm sorry, we don't answer. We don't let people raise their hands. We don't open the mic, so please just retype in the Q&A box. Okay, I'll find you and okay. To the person who asked the question, can you ask your question over the mic? Are you with us, Mohammed?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Alaikum
salam.
Yeah. So basically, sustained shared thinking is where we have a deep conversation with the child and let the talk flow. Because when we talk about weaning the child away from breastfeeding and all that, so at what age can we have that sustained shared thinking with the child? At what age? I don't know if it's related to what we have been speaking now, but what I mean is, at what age do we have that conversation with the child? That in that conversation with the child.
You can start having those kinds of conversations from, as early as day one after delivery, because you want to create that type of in-depth conversations with the infant to allow those brain cells are lighting up like rapidly. So as early as you can start, you want to start those kinds of conversations. And what we actually talk about in infant mental health is called mentalizing. So what the parent does is they try to wonder what the infant is trying to say back to them. So the caregiver will say, I wonder if you're tired. I wonder if you want to eat something. Or they'll name what they think the infant is feeling. And those conversations can happen very early on already, because like I said, the infants are human beings. They are people. We have to recognize that this is a person. And when we talk to them like a person, they tend to develop in their thinking, or their minds develop much quicker, as opposed to an infant that is not being spoken to in that way.
Okay, great. Somebody asks, I keep on shouting at my toddler, so I would like to know how to stop as it is tiring. I never thought I would be a parent that shouts. Maybe I need to do development on myself. Any advice for this person?
So something that a psychologist once said to us also, when I was doing my course, was that we often say we're not going to do things the way things were done to us. So I want this person to think about whether they were shouted at as a child, because we often do things as behaviors that we learn somewhere in our life. We repeat them, we do them because it's what we know. And a lot of people say, I'm not going to shout to my child, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, especially when they experience it themselves. And what you actually need to think about when you do something like that is, were you shouted at, or were you treated like that as a child? And do you remember how you felt when it was done to you? Because a lot of times we repeat behaviors because we don't remember how it made us feel when it was done to us. So it's totally subconscious that we do it that way. So what you as a parent needs to think about is, why am I shouting? Is it because it's the only way that I can communicate? Because then your shouting is also expressing a need that has not been addressed in your life. So you need to think about, what do I need that's not being met? And how can I remember, if you were shouted at as a child, remember how it made you feel, and think about how it's making your children feel. Because when you tap into the part of your parenting that makes you wonder how your children are feeling, it will basically stop you in your tracks at some point, and you'll be like, okay, this is not the way to respond to them. Maybe I must try a different route.
Okay, shukran for that. Does anyone else have any questions before we end off? I'll just wait a few more minutes to see if any last questions come through. I'd like to know about, I know there are differences of opinion about baby sleeping in a different room, or baby sleeping in the same bed as the mom, or in a separate cot. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it depends on the parenting. If that is something that the parents decide that, if the infant is going to sleep in a different room, again, it's the responsiveness from the caregiver that the infant needs. So again, you're just going to prepare the infant and say, this is going to be your room. This is where you're going to sleep. I'm going to put all your favorite things in here. But if you need me, this is what you need to do, and I will come. And a lot of parents have no issue doing that. They put the infant in another room. They have these monitors or whatever that they need to actually check if the baby's okay. And when the baby cries or expresses a need, the parent is there. And it doesn't have to be the parent. It can be anybody that can respond. We have lots of people that have nannies, grandparents, aunties, anyone really can be the caregiver. So anyone can respond to the infant as long as there is a response.
Okay, sure. It actually answers another question I had, because I was thinking, it sounds like there's so much responsibility on that primary caregiver. So it sounds like you're saying that that responsibility can be shared over, the husband, maybe the mom, other people as well.
Yes, definitely. The primary caregiver is the one that the child will attach to first, but it's always recommended to have more caregivers, because we do know that mothers get burnt out. They carry a lot, and especially when they carry the mental load of the infant, they also are going to need a break. So we want the other caregivers in the household or in the family to help the mother out with the caregiving of the infant.
Sure, shukran so much. So we have come to the end of today's session. I think it was very, very informative. Yeah, I haven't actually seen, this is my first infant mental health webinar that I've attended, and I haven't actually seen a lot out there on infant mental health. So hopefully, inshallah, we'll have more sessions on, different aspects of infant mental health in the future, inshallah. So shukran so much to you and to everyone who's attended. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for you and your family and for all of the moms out there, and help us all and accept our efforts and our striving and help us to improve and protect all the children out there. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen.
Ameen, inshallah. Shukran so much.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.